It's great that you could all join us this afternoon. Mark is our guest. He is the author of two books that we're going to talk about. Mostly we're going to talk about Ambush at Central Park, but his first book from 2015, I believe. This one came out in last fall, in the fall of 23. The Sons of Molly Maguires was published in 2015. But so his publishing endeavors are sidelined. He is actually an editor, a standards editor at the New York Times. No small feat in itself. He has roots in the coal mine area of Pennsylvania, and thus the interest in the Molly Maguires, which we'll get to. He currently lives in New Jersey, I believe, and works at the New York Times. He's a graduate of Georgetown, and we're very happy to have him with us today. So let me just spotlight you so we can get started. And there he is. I'll do myself too. There we go. So, okay, Mark, how are you?
I'm good. Thank you, Linda, for that nice introduction. Happy to be here. Always happy to talk about Irish history and Irish, sort of the violent collisions of Irish and American history.
Right. Yeah, and almost Ireland. I mean, America being, especially New York, an extension of Ireland in many ways, especially in these two stories. But before we start, just curious, you are a standards editor. Do you want to give us a little glimpse into what that is?
Sure. So if your motto is all the news that's fit to print, somebody has to decide what's fit to print. So I read a lot of like the more sensitive stories. It might be teenage suicide or a Me Too case, or the sensitive stories that could get us in trouble. I just make sure they're up to snuff. We also handle ethics issues. Look at photos. Is it okay to print this photo out of Gaza or whatever? And as a sidelight, I'm sort of the newsroom headline consultant. So whenever anybody's having trouble writing a headline, they come to me and I help them out.
And let me see, mute. Okay. Just going back. And what about this week? I bet you were consumed with that story about the assassination, for lack of a better word. What to show, what not to show.
Yeah. I mean, that one has been pretty straightforward so far. One thing, we would want to look out for on that story is that, like, whoever this guy is, he's like young, good looking, and apparently pretty intelligent. If he's evaded the cops for, how many days is it? And the other thing is, like, righteous revenge stories. We've been like raised on them. I mean, that's what Ambush in Central Park is sort of all about. So we just need to like kind of make sure we're not glamorizing.
Yeah. Like the bomber story in Boston.
So.
Yeah. Okay. So let's get started with the ambush. What drew you to this story?
Well, there was a review of my first book pointed me towards one of Peter Hart's books about the War for Independence in Cork. And I read that, and there was just one line in there, one sentence, offhand mention of the IRA sending 3 guys to New York to shoot an informer. And I was intrigued. Hey, this is my turf, this is New York City. And I used to do a regular history feature for the Times about the first time that like famous people or things appeared in the pages of the Times. So I was very familiar with our electronic archive and how to use it. And so when I saw this, I just, went to the archive and pulled up the front page, and there it was at the top of the front page, a very detailed account of. We had lots of witnesses. The shooting took place on a on a warm April evening at 84th and Central Park West, and there were a lot of people out, just out for a stroll.
The old,
Yes, that's
yeah,
that's the location.
a
Uh,
school building. It's now an apartment building.
yeah, yeah.
I
So
just
we had lots of witness accounts, and
sorry about that, Trini. Sorry.
um, there were lots of witness accounts that were pretty detailed, and I found that pretty compelling. And I did some more research, and I found a written statement online by the trigger man, that detailed everything that led up to the shooting and what happened afterwards. The Irish government sent around military historians in the 18 or the 1950s to interview IRA veterans from the War for Independence. And
Which government? The Irish government or
The Irish
Yeah.
government, yeah. And one of the guys they interviewed was the trigger man. So I had this detailed account from him that included like what he was thinking at the time, and it's rare that you can like get inside someone's head from 100 years ago like that. Um,
Let me
and
the other interesting thing is there's usually some code of silence around
right,
killings
right.
like that. So
Well,
it must have been very old or everybody else was gone.
I was about to get to that because there was a page and a half that was redacted that described the actual moment when he pulled the trigger. And boy, did I want that page and a half. So I sent the Irish Military Archives an email that said, look, I know why this was redacted back in the 1950s. If he had ever come to America, maybe he would have faced some legal issues. But everybody's been dead for decades. So is there any chance I could get this redacted portion? And I thought they would either say no or fill out these 12 forms and send us, $3,000 and we'll get it to you in a year or whatever. What I was not expecting was what happened, which was the next morning I came downstairs at like 6 a.m., poured myself a cup of coffee, opened my phone, looked at my email, and boom, there was the redacted portion. And I've been in the newspaper business for almost 45 years. I've never seen a government react to a request for information that quickly. And it was just crucial for. So once I had that, I knew I was like, this is a book. Yeah, this is a book.
And so, all right, so now you've got this information. I don't know, the central figure in this story is Cruxy O'Connor.
He's
So
the informer, right?
Want to give us a little, well, that would be the book, but why, like, what did he do? Why was he chased across the Atlantic?
He was a really complicated and kind of twisted character. He started out as a paid spy for the crown, and then he stopped reporting into the British and actually joined the Irish Republican Army. And
early 20s?
yes,
Early 20s? Okay.
early 20s, like 19, his first recorded action was in December of 1920. And interestingly, his first recorded action was the shooting of a suspected spy.
Interesting.
Yeah, for a guy who had been a spy.
Right.
And he, after that, he went on the run, joined a flying column, and took part in a like set piece battle between the flying column and this British convoy. His they gave him a very important job, which was manning one of two machine guns. And the machine guns stopped firing almost as soon as the battle began. And there are, some people thought he was still on the side of the Brits. Some people said, oh, well, the thing jammed. But shortly after that, he went back to Cork. He was Cork City. He was caught in possession of a gun, and he was in civilian clothes. And Cork was under martial law, and you could be executed for that.
Mhm.
So he flipped again, turned informer, gave away.
This time for who? So first was for the
Right.
Brits. Now he's an informer for,
For the British.
okay.
He's an informer for the British. They have caught him, and they're going to execute him if he doesn't cooperate. So he gives away the location of a safe house
Hmm.
where 6 IRA men from his neighborhood, including his next door neighbor, are sleeping. The
Wow.
British raid the place, capture these guys sleeping, and kill them.
Mm.
They couldn't keep their story straight. At first, they said the 6 IRA men were killed in a gun battle. Then they said they were killed trying to escape. Um, it was pretty clear that what happened was they were caught sleeping. The Brits told them to run and then shot them all in the back.
Oh, wow.
So what O'Connor didn't realize when he was talking with the Brits was that some people among the Crown forces were talking to the IRA.
Oh.
It was, Cork City in the early 20s had, was probably worse than Berlin in the 1960s in terms of an intelligence war. It was really complicated. So there were some members of the constabulary who were sympathetic to the IRA or were simply outraged at the cold-blooded murder of these guys.
Mhm.
And they quickly informed the IRA that Cruxy was the culprit here. He was the one who had given away the safe house. And so the IRA was determined to get him. He was in protective custody in Victoria Barracks in Cork, which was British Army headquarters. And they sent in a woman dressed as his mother to bring him a home cooked meal that had, the quote was, there was enough strychnine to poison a regiment in this meal. And they very nearly pulled it off. The only reason the plan failed was that a squad of IRA men was assigned to guard the real Mrs. O'Connor so that she didn't show up with her home cooked meal. And this squad of IRA men was no match for Mrs. O'Connor. She busted loose, marched off to Victoria Barracks, and got there just in time to save her son. In fact, the fake Mrs. O'Connor was going through the gate as she was coming in through the gate. So she got there just in the nick of time to save her son. After that, he fled to London. They sent a couple of guys to get him in London. The British got wind of that, and he got on a boat to New York, figuring he would be safe in America.
Okay, I have a couple of questions there, but let's stay in Ireland for a bit. You do a really good job in the book of sort of putting some context around those years in Dublin and in Cork City too, between the Anglo-Irish War and then the Civil War, and the historical context, the details you provide are really interesting, and among them are how many women were involved in these battles, and one in particular, Jo Marchmont. I know she's got several names: Brown, Marchmont, O'Donoghue. But you want to give us a little tidbit on her? I mean, she's a fascinating character.
She's the most fascinating character in the book, as far as I'm concerned. She is just this amazing woman and a very determined woman and a very ruthless woman.
Mm.
Um, she is working simultaneously for two archenemy intelligence chieftains who are trying to kill each other. She's her day job is as the chief clerk in Victoria Barracks, where she's working for Captain Kelly, who is the British intelligence chief in Cork City. He's actually an Irishman uh, who grew up in Knock. Um, and so her day job is with him. And since she's the chief clerk, she has access to everything. Uh, it's her, she supervises the people who are like making duplicates of reports and everything. So her day job is working for him, but she's also working with Fleury O'Donoghue on the sly. He is the IRA's intelligence chieftain in Cork. And among the three, if you ask me, if there's a spy master among the three, it's her. She always manages to get what she wants and get away with it. She ends up romantically involved with Fleury O'Donoghue. They in fact they get married on the sly. But she gets any number of people killed. She got three British intelligence officers killed in like one incident. She talked about and she laid all this out in a pension application to the Irish government after the war for independence. She got at least three informers killed. She was just a very determined and kind of ruthless individual.
The that footnote about how, the detail on some of her escapades, when I saw that it was on an application for a pension, that is just fascinating. I guess you had to prove your bona fides
Yes, yes,
member of the IRA in order to qualify for the income. I mean,
right.
that is crazy.
Yeah, I worked with I was in touch with a professor at University College Cork who is the main expert on Cork during the War for Independence and the Civil Wars. He's actually an American named John Borganova, and I had told him what I was up to with this Cruxy O'Connor project, and he was really interested. And the way I got a hold of that pension application was he emailed me and said, Mark, you've got to check it. This just went online. You've got to check out this pension application. And I did, and I got a whole chapter out of it. It was just fascinating. So yeah.
And so it sounds like you didn't even have to go over to Ireland. You were able to access a lot of digitized records.
Yes, the Irish government has put an astonishing amount of material online. And I actually couldn't get to Ireland because of the pandemic.
Okay.
And I had to cancel um, I had to cancel two trips. One was I was about to go, and my mother-in-law died, so I canceled. And then I was going to go the next year, and COVID shut everything down.
Hmm.
So there were a few things in archives in Dublin that were not online, and I was like, I got to get this stuff. How am I going to get this? And I just sent an email to the history department at University College Dublin and said, hey, do you have, if you've got any graduate students who are looking to make a little extra money, you could, the archives were right there at UCD. And I said, I just need someone to go find these documents. I've got the call numbers for them. I just need someone to like take a picture of them with their iPhone and send them to me. And so that's what I did. And
Wow.
it worked out beautiful.
Um, That's very ingenious of you. I think a lot of good work has come out of COVID. Artistic and historical, people had time on their hands for things they couldn't get to before 2020. The other thing I think is interesting too is that she started working for the IRA because she wanted them to kidnap her son, who
This,
was being
yeah,
held hostage by her in-laws.
this this is an amazing story. I mean, she on paper she looked perfect for a clerk in British Army headquarters because she looked like a loyal citizen of Britain. Her father was a chief constable in the Royal Irish Constabulary. She was the widow of a British soldier, an English soldier who got killed on the Western Front. Um, but he was an English Protestant, and his parents and his sisters uh, leaned on him to write a letter before he went off to the Western Front that said, if anything happens to me, I want my son raised here in England or here in Wales by my family, not in Ireland. So she ended up in this custody battle, which she lost. And she went back to Ireland despondent and hit upon the idea of, well, maybe I could work something out with the IRA. And she did. Essentially, the deal was if they would kidnap her son from her hated in-laws and bring him to Ireland, she would provide all this information. And that's how it went. The weird thing is that the British knew there was a huge leak in Victoria Barracks. They knew information was going out and getting people killed, getting British intelligence officers killed. And they knew that her son had been kidnapped by Irish gunmen. And yet she was allowed to continue as chief clerk, which is a kind of a weird thing. And it took me a while to get my brain wrapped around it. And then I saw her account of she was supposed to meet Terence McSweeney, who was the Lord Mayor of Cork and also the head of the IRA, because she had been spying for the IRA for a year, and the IRA was not making progress in getting her son back to Ireland. And she figured that Terence McSweeney, was the key to the situation. So she arranged a meeting with him on a night in August at 8 o'clock. She didn't show up, but the British Army did, and they arrested him. And this was the beginning of the famous hunger strike that led to his death. And the really interesting thing for me was her excuse for why she didn't show up that night, which was this. She said she was about to go to the meeting. She walked out the door, and the next door neighbor who had bad eyesight, asked her to read the paper for her. So she sat down and read the paper for this neighbor instead of going to this crucial meeting. I mean, this woman was risking her life to get her son back. And this meeting was all about getting her son back. And she didn't show, supposedly, because she had to read the paper for her neighbor. The interesting thing to me is that while Terence McSweeney was the head of the IRA in Cork, the kidnapping did not proceed. Once he was removed, the kidnapping did proceed. So I have kind of a sneaking suspicion that she was working both sides to advance her own agenda.
Uh, she really intrigued me. I mean, and her story has so many elements, any one of which would be good enough for a short story. you know, name something, but it made me wonder too, was there something, she was an attractive woman, did the Brits not think, or that she was capable of this kind of treachery, espionage, you know, not
Wh-
just,
wh-
you know, the femme fatale or whatever, but she got away with a lot.
She got away with a lot. And, she talked about how she had charmed the British intelligence officers.
Mm-hmm.
And the head British intelligence officer was this Irishman, Captain Kelly, who was a womanizer.
Mm,
And I don't know if there was anything going on between them, or maybe they just reached a pragmatic kind of accommodation whereby they would keep each other alive through this crazy period.
yeah,
Because the IRA tried to kill Captain Kelly on any number of occasions, and something always went wrong. There were ambushes, and like he was supposed to be in the vehicle and he wasn't. Or they, tried a few sexual snares for him. And it always fell through almost as if he'd been warned, you
mm,
know. So the only thing that really makes sense to me for why she wasn't caught is that maybe Captain Kelly was protecting her because maybe she was protecting him.
right, right. So if they stayed together, they stayed alive. If
Right,
one ratted out the other,
right,
the whole
right.
thing falls apart.
It's pure speculation, but
Yeah, right.
it's kind of the only way to make sense of how she was allowed to continue. Even one of Michael Collins's top aides commented on the fact that like he was amazed that the suspicions that you would ex expect her to come under seemingly hadn't materialized.
Right, right. Or if they did, nobody acted on it.
Right, right. Yeah,
Uh, it's just striking how much spying, double spying, lies. I just finished, I was saying to the group before you joined in, I just finished watching the Say Nothing production on Hulu.
yes,
So many parallels. The two sisters involved and how they were used. The the touting, just no one can trust the other. The I just was thinking about the pressure these people were under, like just the constant threat of being uncovered or just trying to live in that community where there was so much tension, so much fighting, so much violence going on all the time.
right.
Uh,
And Cork was like sort of ground zero for the war for independence.
Mm.
It was to the war for independence what like Belfast was for the Troubles. Um, and it was the main battlefield. And the amount of paranoia that people must have had to live with, uh, uh, it's hard to imagine how the mental energy required to keep
yeah,
all
right.
your lies straight.
Or, going back to the Reef book is to just say nothing. It's just easier to say nothing because then you don't have to remember who you said
Yeah,
what to.
right,
Just
right,
keep your mouth shut.
right.
Uh, so now we've got all this espionage, this intrigue back and forth. O'Connor's on his way over to the US to New York, and we'll get into some of the reasons why New York was such a support system for Ireland. But it struck me as I was thinking about it today is, Ireland being, or New York rather, being so Irish and so many people from Ireland going into New York and the US in the 1920s. I think it was the biggest period of migration in the 20th century, 200,000 during the 1920s before they shut the gates. Why New York? It would be just like going to Dublin. There's so many Irish there. How could he expect to hide in a city, even though there's a lot of people in New York? It's a
Um,
lot of Irish, and he went into an Irish neighborhood to hide. It was
he
his family.
he had an aunt here, which is he had a relative here, which is why a lot of immigrants came to New York because they already had some kind of family connection. And I suspect he didn't really conceive of just how Irish New York was at the
Mhm.
time, and also couldn't conceive that, or maybe he could have, I don't know. Like he just figured he'd be safe on this side of the Atlantic. Um,
Yeah, but, or maybe he didn't think they would chase him that far.
he knew were chasing him in London. He was aware of that. Um, and he was here about 6 months when he realized that they were stalking him in New York. Uh,
Mhm. Yeah, well, because he was at B. Altman's, and he
right.
wasn't
Yeah.
really undercover, working and living in broad daylight. All right, so back up a little with the Irishness of New York and its sort of extension to what was happening in Ireland in the early part of the 1920s. You talk about some of the efforts of the Irish in New York to support the IRA on the other side, gun running, the Tommy guns that the manufacturer Thompson. I mean, you want to share a little bit about that, and then even again, the women in enter into this story too by creating problems for the boat, unloading the boats or letting the British dignitaries come off onto the docks in New York.
Yeah. They like instigated a dock strike in New York because so many of the longshoremen were Irish, and they just like marched down to the waterfront when McSweeney was on hunger strike, and convinced all these dock workers to hit the bricks, and they did, and it spread from New York to Boston, to and Philadelphia, Brooklyn, so they played like a really important role there. But one of the things that amazed me in doing the research on this was like just the level of institutional support for the IRA among politicians and high-ranking police officials and the Catholic Church. Um, the guy who provided the Irish American who Union guy who he provided the guns for the ambush at Central Park. A year before that had been involved in this wild gun running plot that involved they almost pulled it off. They had 500 brand new Tommy guns loaded onto a ship docked in Hoboken. Before, before they got to Hoboken, before they were loaded onto the ship, they were stored in the basement of a Carmelite church in
29th
Manhattan.
Street. Yeah.
The head of the Carmelite order was a member of the Irish Republican Brotherhood. So, I mean, there was just this level of institutional support that was amazing when the plot unraveled, and that was only because like an assistant cook who was one of the few crewmen who was not in on the plot. He spotted a burlap bag outside the galley, and he like pulled out a knife to see what was in the burlap. He was thinking potatoes or something, I guess. And then he spots a Tommy gun and starts, screaming bloody murder. And pretty soon the customs people are on board. It took them um, days to find, where all the guns were stashed, because in the meantime they had moved them out of that area and into a hold. But so the customs guys confiscate 500 Tommy guns, and the gun runners, you would think, might just give up at that point. It's the feds have moved in and confiscated this stuff. No way. They get in touch with the mayor of Hoboken and the Hoboken police chief, both of whom are Irish American, and tell them what's going on. And the police chief says, do anything we can to help you. So the Hoboken police go down to the dock and confiscate the guns from the federal customs guys, and haul them off to Hoboken police headquarters. And this almost comical legal battle ensues. And in the end, short-term customs got to keep the Tommy guns, but over several years, this battle kept going. And I think by 1926, the customs just gave up, and the Tommy guns ended up going to Ireland, where they were still in use like into the 1970s. But
That's unbelievable.
there were just there's just story after story like that. There was another one where um, a guy was driving a truckload of bullets um, through Manhattan, and he got stopped because you got to remember this is during Prohibition, and suspicious truckloads were just getting stopped by police looking for illegal booze. And he figured, most of the NYPD is sort of on our side. I'll just explain this to the officer. Well, the officer, unfortunately for him, for the gun runner, was Polish American. He wasn't Irish American. So the gun runners got hauled off to a precinct house and interrogated. He gets sent down to the tombs. They figure they're really in deep shit now. But meanwhile, political wheels are turning, strings are being pulled, and by the time they end up in court, they're charged with like a traffic offense and let go with just a minor fine. And on the way out of the court, there's a couple of high-ranking NYPD guys there who stop them and apologize for the arrest and give them a phone number and say, listen, just call this number and you can get that cargo back. So there were all kinds of stories like that were just amazing to me, because you didn't see that kind of like institutional support for the IRA during the Troubles in the 70s and the 80s
Oh, no,
and the
no,
90s.
no, it's a different world. The things
Yeah,
have
yeah.
changed. Yeah, in the 1920s, like you said, labor, the church, the
The
Democratic
politicians.
Party, all Irish, all in support of for whatever reason, all because they were first generation or they're recent immigrants themselves, or they were just in control of all those institutions at that point.
Right, right.
Yeah, 50 years later is a little different.
One of the reasons the three gunmen got away after the ambush at Central Park was that Dave Valera had a guy in the DA's office in New York who word was he put the kibosh on the case.
And they were allowed to leave.
Oh yeah, they weren't allowed to leave. They just left. It's not like they were ever in custody. They were
Okay.
never caught.
That's what I wondered. I didn't know how much to reveal about this. So they spot Cruxy. Was it at a parade or somewhere? And they waited outside his apartment and then chased him into Central Park.
The parade story is bogus. One of the three gunmen, decades later, claimed that it was Palm Murray. He claimed he was doing an interview with both an Irish journalist and I think later somebody for the New York Times, and he essentially told them both the same story, which was that he was the gunman, he was the trigger man, he was the one who spotted Cruxy. He claimed and it was his idea on how to find Cruxy. He said, according to this story, he said, "Oh, he'll be at the St. Patty's Day parade. We'll just go to the St. Patty's Day parade and we'll find him there." And so they go to the parade, and according to Mary, he's like, "Oh, and there he was right across the street from us." And then he says, and I got a friendly New York cop to follow him home so we know where he lived. And then we got a different friendly New York cop to give us the guns for the shooting. Well, it was all just nonsense that was kind of inflating his role in all this. Um, the main guy, the trigger man, was someone named Danny Healy, and Danny Healy said it didn't happen anything like that. He gave this kind of detailed account to the Irish government historians. There was nothing in there about the St. Patty's Day parade. What they did was they went to they had tracked Cruxy to his last known address, I guess, which was staying with his aunt, and had asked some questions around there until they found out like where he had moved to, which makes kind of a lot more sense than
Mhm.
like, can you imagine the degree of luck involved in trying to find one person at the St. Patrick's Day parade in New York?
Yeah.
It just stretched
Far-fetched, yeah.
credibility. So they, laid in wait. And to me, the interesting thing was the timing of the shooting. When the British raided this safe house in Cork uh, and killed these six guys, six IRA men, it was Spy Wednesday. It was the Wednesday of Holy Week. And a year later, on Holy Thursday, that's when they pulled off the ambush. And if there's one thing I've been struck by through this whole thing, it's like the importance of dates and anniversaries. And one thing I learned just from reading the newspapers from the day after the shooting was that there was something else important that happened involving Ireland at the very moment that Cruxy was being shot in New York. The anti-treaty IRA guys were seizing the four courts.
Mm.
And that was essentially the opening act of the Irish Civil War. Now, Cruxy was shot at around 8:30 on a Thursday night in New York, but Dublin was several hours ahead. So as he was being shot, it was the early morning hours of Good Friday. So here's the anti-treaty IRA seizing a huge government building in the middle of Dublin on Easter weekend, 5 years after the Easter uprising. Just the mere timing is statement, right?
Right.
Um,
No, I hadn't realized all that until I read the book, and it sort of leads in, we can finish up, leads into what you write about with the Molly Maguires and the importance of dates and holidays and how that figures into the cultural aspect of the Molly Maguires over here and their origin in Ireland.
yeah, absolutely.
It is kind of fascinating. Yeah, so the he gets chased out of Central Park, gunned down. It's very dramatic, falls on the steps, and the three guys it's kind of funny. They try to, the car pulls up, but Healy won't jump in the car.
There's this interesting, fascinating thing that happens, which is that Danny Healy, who is an experienced gunman, I mean, and the IRA itself used that term when they were describing someone. It wasn't a general term. They were referring quite specifically to a trigger man. Like you would have, the driver, and then you would have the gunman, and the gunman was the one who, like, pulled the trigger. So he was an experienced. This was his not the first time he had done this. He had been on some spectacular assassinations in Ireland, including the killing of the provincial police commander for Southern Ireland. But he freezes after the shooting. Cruxy's down there on the ground. Danny Healy looks around, and there's this huge crowd of Americans just staring at him. And what's going through his head is no chance of escape, no chance of escape. And one of his comrades, yells out to him. Martin Donovan is the comrade, and he's an older guy, and he almost has a protective, fatherly almost relationship with Danny Healy, who's like maybe 21 or 22. And Martin Donovan, who's in the getaway car, yells, "Run for it, Danny, run!" And Danny Healy takes off, or he starts walking away, and then he breaks into a run, and the crowd that has witnessed all this turns into a posse and starts chasing him. There's like 50 people chasing him. He's dropped his gun, so because it was empty, he dropped it basically right on top of Cruxy. And he starts walking away and then running away, and he's being chased. And Martin Donovan sees what's going on, and he knows he needs to do something. And he pulls off, I think it's one of the most amazing scenes in the book, where he gets out of the getaway car and confronts this crowd of 50 people. He's unarmed because he had a gun, but it jammed, and he tossed it, because you don't want to be at a crime scene with a useless gun, right? So he had tossed it. So now he's got to pull off a bluff, right? One man against like 50. And he stands in the middle of the street and confronts this crowd. And there's a guy who's leading the crowd. And he says to this guy, "Where do you think you're going?" And he slides his hand into his pocket, his coat pocket, as if to pull a gun. And the guy says, "I'm going right back where I came from." And he turns around on his heels and leaves. And most of the crowd follows him. And but Healy still doesn't get in the car. He's spooked or something. And he ends up running off to to catch the subway. But it's just that scene where Martin Donovan just like kind of faces down this crowd with nothing in his pocket but lint, was
Right. Well, it is kind of funny. It's like when you see someone chase it, like, your dog's chasing the squirrel. What are you going to do when you catch it? I don't know. It just seemed like the right thing to do. So they all get away. I don't know if we should tell what happens with Cruxy, or they leave it for people.
No, leave that one out.
Yeah, read the book. And we'll turn to the Maguires next, but I always wonder too, I know it's the only recorded attack.
Yes.
But with all the people that just exited Ireland during the 1920s, I just wonder how many others were gunned down, and it just was never recorded, or it was attached to a domestic violence issue, or just, basic crime, because they're, given the level of intrigue and distrust and anger.
Yeah. And there was that great novel, Empire Rising, which by Kelly.
Yeah.
Tom Kelly. I read that, and just by the last names, I was like, this guy's family is from Cavan. These are Cavan names.
Really?
And it turned out that was the case.
Is that right? Yeah.
Interesting. But it was a really good, entertaining novel, which revolves around an IRA man in New York who ends up, spoiler alert, getting killed, not because he's an informer, but for other reasons. The way I phrased it in the book, I think, was something like the only officially authorized, attack on U.S. soil.
Right.
And it's possible that there might have been other violence, like one-on-one, but this was like an official IRA operation with 3 guys. It was authorized by Michael Collins himself.
Right.
In fact, the way they got to when they came to America, when these 3 guys came from Cork to America, they got to England by pretending to be part of Michael Collins's party when he went over to negotiate the treaty. So it's interesting. You see
Oh,
these
so they
guys.
came here by way of England?
Yes, they came here by way of England, and they got to England by, being part of supposedly the delegation that
Hmm.
was going over to negotiate the treaty. So you find these guys like being part of like bigger things like the treaty. They weren't involved in the negotiations, but
Right,
they
right.
were adjacent.
Tangential,
Um,
yeah.
so there might have been, some one-on-one violence, and there were things like, there was that Brinks heist up in
Mhm.
Rochester during the Troubles. That there was talk about the IRA being involved in that, but that connection was so tenuous they couldn't even mention it in the trial.
Yeah.
There was a bomb, a letter bomb sent to the British Embassy in Washington in the early 70s that injured a secretary, I think. I think she like lost a part of a finger or something. But there was never, it was probably the IRA, but it wasn't US soil. That embassy was officially,
Right,
British soil, and there was never a claim of responsibility that you could say this was definitely the IRA, and you don't know for sure who sent it, you know. So it's possible, but this was like an IRA operation. This was like a military operation.
yeah. If they're just for optics, for a lot of reasons, it was probably better for them not to be disruptive on US soil to keep the
Right.
American Irish friendly and happy and supportive. Yeah.
They were raising so much money here.
Yeah.
And one of the things that surprised me was that uh, immediately after the shooting, uh, not immediately, but a few days after the shooting, they went to Philadelphia and visited with Joe McGarity, who was the IRA's main fundraiser in
To
the
the three
United States.
gunmen.
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
It was McGarity who had come up with the money for the 500 Tommy guns. He helped fund 1916. He was the IRA's main fundraiser for decades up until he died in 1940. And I was very surprised that they would go and visit him because that made him an accomplice after the fact to,
Right.
this ambush in a state that bordered Pennsylvania. Um, his home was a stopping point for every major Republican figure from, Pierce to Dave Valera, but, you know, they were mostly politicians. They were not they were
Right.
not wanted for a crime,
Right.
in the US. So I was a little surprised that they went and spent time with him, for precisely the reason you said. The United States was invaluable as a source of money and publicity and propaganda, and and as
Government
huge.
support. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, okay. Well, how are we doing on time? I would like to touch on the Molly Maguires a bit, and in a lot of ways, this sort of explains your connection to things Irish. Your last name is Bulik. Doesn't really sound Irish. Not that that means anything, but you have roots in the coal mining country.
Yeah, my mother grew up in the anthracite region in Pennsylvania. Her name was O'Connor, and she came from this
No
big.
relation to Cruxy.
No, oh, sorry, no, no, really. Our O'Connors were from South Ulster. He was from Cork. No connection. Very common name. Yeah, no, no connection. But she grew up in this long time coal mining family. There's like 5 generations of coal miners on my mom's side of the family, going from my great grandfather, William Lynch, who came over from Cabin, to my cousin Joey Lynch, who was working in a mine back in the 1970s. Um, so, uh, I was familiar with the area. We used to go up there and visit all the time. We have relatives up there. And, the movie, the Molly Maguires, came out around 1970 when I was probably 12. And Sean Connery, Richard Harris, great movie. And my mother told me that the movie was based on a book that had been written by a friend of one of my great aunts. So I read the book, and I was very surprised when I read the book to find out that the Molly Maguires in Pennsylvania got started in Cass Township, which happened to be where my mother was born and grew up, and where my family had been mining coal for, 150 years or something. Um, so I was always kind of interested in the Molly Maguires, and I would read anything I could get on them, because I had a lot of questions, and the more I read, the more questions I had. I mean, one of the main questions was like, why Cass Township?
Mm.
Um, but beyond that, it was like, as I read more about the Molly Maguires in Ireland, they got started during the famine, or just before the famine, winter of 1844, 1845. And they tended to peg their attacks to big holidays like New Year's, or the Feast of Bridget, or Halloween. And
Yeah.
I thought that was or Midsummer's Day, and I thought that was like really curious. And I was also they also dressed in really weird outfits. They would um, wear women's clothes, or straw clothing, or blackface. And so I wanted to know why. This just seemed like a strange thing to do. And none of the books I read really gave me a clue as to any of the answers to those questions, until um, at some point in the 1990s, I happened to pick up a book about mummers in South Fermanagh. And as I read the book, I was just flabbergasted, because it described how
Wow.
these mummers would go around on like big holidays like New Year's, and they would dress in women's clothes, or straw clothing, or blackface, and they would put on a play. And the play always involved the killing. And suddenly, all of this kind of came together for me. And basically, what I figured out was that, like, the Molly Maguires and the Mummers were not different things. They were just flip sides of the same coin. When the Mummers would go around, they would put on this play, and they would collect money, and then they would throw a party, and they would invite everyone whose home they had visited to this party. And it was a way of like bringing the community together, promoting community. And come the famine, come the potato famine, suddenly you have these guys dressed in identical outfits in the same part of Ireland, South Ulster, and the Ulster borderlands, Leitrim, Roscommon, and they're going around and they're collecting money, just as the mummers collected money, but they're doing it to help the starving. And if
Mm.
you don't give money, the play acting violence of the mummers could turn into the real thing. And at one point, I went over to Dublin to do some research, and I was going through crime reports from the 1840s, and it was really striking. In late fall, early winter of 1844, there's this drumbeat of Molly Maguire attacks. They're raiding houses for arms, they're beating people, they're putting up threatening notices, uh, right up until Christmas. And then boom, it's like there's a Christmas ceasefire. And that lasts for 3 weeks. And when the 3 weeks end, suddenly the attacks really ramp up. And the very first killing is right around the Feast of Bridget. And what's striking is that those 3 weeks just happen to be the 3 weeks when the mummers are going around doing their thing, you know? So I was just kind of like thunderstruck by the realization that like these what I thought were like two separate phenomenons were actually just flip sides of the same coin. And if you grow up in Eastern Pennsylvania, as I did, you think you know what the mummers are about. They're these crazy guys who like
Right.
these, they're from like row house Philadelphia neighborhoods like where my dad grew up. And they wear these glittery, feathery, crazy costumes. Then thousands of them march up Broad Street playing banjos. It's like quite the spectacle. So that's the mummers. And if you're Irish and from Eastern Pennsylvania, you think you know what the Molly Maguires are. They're these like gritty coal miners up in Schuylkill County and Carbon County who are, trying to get the coal company's boot off their neck. And so it was like, wow, wow, wow. If there were, if the mummers and the Molly Maguires were so closely connected in Ireland, then there had to be mummers in the coal region.
Yeah. Just,
And it turned out there were.
yeah, by virtue of geography and the migration pattern, they
Yes,
wound up in the
Right.
same.
exactly. Exactly.
I mean, we could go, I think maybe we should open this up for questions, and you can talk a little bit more about, let me just remove spotlight, and where's mine? Let's unmute everybody. If you've got, can you unmute? Let me do this so I can unmute. Can you unmute yourselves? Or do I have to do it? Ask to unmute. Anybody have any questions for Mark?
There's something in the chat. Let's see.
Okay. let me
Yeah,
see.
about the pension. This is Kathleen. How are you?
Hi, Kathleen.
Mark.
Hi there, Mark. Yeah, my question in the chat was you said that all of these confessions from this woman who was a double spy came out when she filed for a pension. That was a pension in Ireland, like in Cork, or
Yes, it was an Irish government pension. It was for people it was like a soldier's pension for people who had fought for the independence of Ireland.
oh wow. So they really recognized those people who put their life on the line, and was she awarded it?
Yes. Yeah.
That is amazing.
Yeah. I think the pensions were, when Dave Valera came to power, it was his way of trying to ease some of the divisions that had, racked Ireland after the Civil War.
Uh-huh.
So, you know, I think that was, and to recognize, that these folks were, were soldiers who had fought for independence.
So she didn't have to prove any rank or anything like that. She just filled out an application and submitted it and received a pension.
She received a pension. She didn't have to prove rank. I've seen other pension applications where they got very complicated, where people like, had to prove exactly what they were doing in this 6 month period and that 6 month period. And
Wow.
what was he what exactly was his, position during that period? Yeah.
So Dave
And commanders had to sign
What-
off on that.
Yes. Yeah.
did who?
the local commanders had to sign up and authenticate the value of the person claiming a pension, the value in terms of the war.
Uh-huh.
And their
Wow.
participation.
Correct. And their, yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
That's very impressive. And for a woman, I mean, that's very impressive, you know, so she could live comfortably the rest of her days?
Yeah, I mean, she ended up marrying Flory O'Donoghue, who had been the IRA spy master in Cork. He got a government job. And he's actually a really interesting character because much of the book is based on material that he was ultimately responsible for collecting. He convinced De Valera to create the Bureau of Military History. And it was the Bureau of Military History that went around interviewing IRA veterans like Danny Healy to get, these statements about what they had done during the war. So O'Donoghue was not just like a major factor in the war in Cork, but a major factor in preserving the stories from that war. He was probably the most important figure for preserving those stories.
He initiated it, right? Is that what you said? He initiated that?
Yes. Yeah.
And Mark, just the last question. I'm sorry. I'm just trying to get the history because 3 sets of my great-grandparents are from Cork, and I'm going there in July, and it's called the Rebel County.
Yeah.
Is that basically where the Civil War happened or it was instituted mostly?
Well, it's I guess you could say it's where the most intense fighting took place.
Huh.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And Collins is from Cork, right?
Yes. Yeah. And one of the 3 IRA men who were in on this ambush in Cork was there on the day. I'm going to mess up the pronunciation. Belnabla.
Belnabla, yeah.
Yeah, Belnabla. Michael Collins was killed in an ambush at Belnabla, and Pa Murray, who was one of the 3 gunmen in New York, was at an IRA meeting at a pub, like maybe in Belnabla, maybe like half a mile from where that ambush took place.
Huh.
So these guys tended to show up. These 3, you can kind of tell the story of, Cork in the War for Independence through these 3 guys who came to New York.
Wow. Thank you.
Sure.
Great.
John?
I'm curious that O'Connor came to New York, particularly as a Cork man, because one thing that I've noticed about the Cork community in New York is that they're very, very close, very, very close. And more than a lot of the other counties, they keep in touch with their friends and relatives. Now, what did O'Connor do to support himself, and what neighborhood did he live in?
He was a bookkeeper. He worked at B. Altman, and he lived on Columbus Avenue between 83rd and 84th. With his family came over. His mother, his father, his brother, sister-in-law, and his nephew, they all had to leave Cork after he turned informer, because one of the guys he got killed was Will Deasy, who was his next door neighbor. So you can imagine how tense things were. And those 2 families had been feuding for a long time. Anyhow, it may be one of the reasons that O'Connor gave away Will Deasy. So they were all living in this apartment on Columbus Avenue.
Well,
But he gave up his job at at B. Altman because
Hmm.
three guys from Cork were staking the place out.
Yeah, he was a very poor. He made very poor choices. B. Altman, being the Catholic department store of New York, employed a lot of Irish, and the neighborhood that he settled up there on the west side was very territorial, like Irish.
Yes.
So they would have tracked him down just by social comments to one another within a short time. So maybe he was looking to be killed.
Maybe he felt guilty.
Yeah.
Huh, wow.
I would have picked a non-Irish neighborhood, perhaps a neighborhood where there weren't any Irish people living, and his chances would have been a lot better.
If I'd been him, I'd have moved to Atlanta.
Yeah, well, there you go.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking.
Why Atlanta?
Place where maybe he would have stood out more, but they wouldn't have found
Or someplace that didn't have, someplace other than Boston, New York, or Philadelphia.
him. Yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
Or
also,
Chicago,
the other
for
thing
that
is that of course we know that the Cork people have a very nice, distinctive accent. So as soon as he opened his mouth, he was advertising his presence.
Yeah.
Hmm.
He was spotted. He was spotted at B. Altman by someone from Cork.
Hmm.
And the other thing is that about a block from B. Altman was the Waldorf Astoria, which was Dave Valera's headquarters when he was in the United States. So
Wow. Waldorf Astoria, not bad.
I'm
It's
looking forward to
all
reading your book. I
someplace.
think you did a great job.
oh, thank
And
you.
very, very interesting. A story I never heard of, and it's fascinating.
Yeah, it was just kind of totally forgotten. It was all over the front pages for a few days, not just the New York Times. A lot of we had a lot more papers in New York back then. Something I relish as a newspaper man, and it was big news. It got banner headlines in some other papers.
What surprises me is that after being responsible for the deaths of 6 volunteers, that he would come to New York, obviously a very Irish city, and that he would think he could live a normal life here and that nobody would interfere with him.
Huh?
I mean, that level of treachery, resulting in the deaths of 6 people
Yeah.
was massive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There was another guy in Cork who turned informer and got 6 IRA men killed. Just, I think, either a few weeks or a few months before Cruxy. And he ended up going to Australia, which was probably a better move than New York.
Yeah.
Yeah, farther anyway. Yeah.
I've got a question about the Molly Maguires.
Sure.
What was their time span?
They basically about 1862 to 1875.
Were they just coal miners? Because I've got miners in my family, but they all tend to be zinc.
They were all hard coal miners from the anthracite region of Pennsylvania. And basically, the way that got started was it was the Civil War that triggered everything, because the fellow who was put in charge of the draft in that part of Pennsylvania was a former know-nothing, radical Republican, hated Irish Catholics, hated Democrats, and hated labor activists.
Oh.
So he's put in charge of the draft, and he figures, well, I can use the draft as just one big broom to sweep all these troublemakers out of the coal fields and onto the battlefields. So he set unfairly high conscription quotas for the most heavily Irish Catholic parts of the coal fields, like Cass Township, where my family comes from. And he did it right before a crucial election in 1862 that was going to determine control of Congress.
Right.
And he admitted that he was trying to affect the outcome of the election, because once these guys got sent into the army, you couldn't vote if you were out in the field. So that prompted a pretty violent reaction on the part of the Irish community there. And pretty soon you had hundreds of guys under arms marching from mine to mine, shutting them down, and that was pretty much the trigger.
Okay.
No mail-in ballots. That's crazy.
Yeah.
And around the same time as that was 62, 63 riots in New York.
Yes. Yeah.
I've been doing work with another group with the Nuns of the Battlefield, and they were actually the Catholic sisters who went in and took care of the soldiers, both Confederate and Yankee.
They were a godsend.
They were mostly Irish Catholic girls who either came off the boat or were the daughters of people who came off the boat.
Yeah.
Tell about activism.
One of the reasons it was so unfair to, put this really heavy draft quota on these Irish Catholic areas was that there were like a whole lot of Irish Catholics who had volunteered to serve in the Union Army, including some of my ancestors. And it was really unfortunate what happened, because when they would come home from the war, they were almost considered traitors, because the mine owners had brought in the Union Army to put down labor trouble in the coal fields. So people didn't like soldiers in Union blue.
Mhm. Thank you.
Sure.
Ed McCarthy here from Alexandria, Virginia. All very interesting, and any number of thoughts here. I'm wondering about, you mentioned, roots in Ireland of the Molly Maguires. And I'm thinking that given that time period, isn't that also the time period of the Land League and those?
The Land League.
Land League was later.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Land League was later. Like the Mollies were most active in from the mid 40s through the 1850s, and the Land League, I think, was more like late 1870s into
Yeah.
1880s.
That's true. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, yeah. Well, I thought there was some, you got up to 1875. I will just mention my best friend who was up in Massachusetts. His dad was in the IRA, and indeed got I know whether he got a pen. I know he's got a medal.
Yeah.
I was unclear about exactly what he did in the IRA. He had a story, and some of these stories can be apocryphal, let's put it that way, in which he has a drink in a bar with a British officer, and then if they go outside, he shoots the guy, and then commandeers a ship out of Cove out of Cork, and it comes to America. And then indeed in the 1920s, he was a carryman. And anyway, it was an extremely interesting story. As many aspects of what you've talked about are of interest to me, but I'll let other folks, if they're very good questions.
So I'm just curious, the source of the pension was the Irish government, the Republic of Ireland?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
And they were very detailed.
Yeah,
you know, it's a gold mine for a researcher.
yes.
Good. And how many women, do you know if, as a percentage of that total?
Oh, no.
I'm not to hear the big names, but
Yeah, I know, I know the woman who tried to, who imitated Mrs. O'Connor and took the poisoned meal to Victoria Barracks in Cork. I know she got a pension. I know Joe Marchment got a pension. Uh, but I'm not sure. I would suspect that the overwhelming majority of the pensions went to men. Just
numbers game, yeah. Okay. Anybody else? Well, Mark, this is really fascinating. I would encourage everyone to buy, it's Christmas time in Central Park. And this book, what I'll say about it, it's very dense, but there's so much information here, Mark, about tying the history of the Mollies in Ulster and how they come over here and how those customs are translated to an American culture. It's really, really interesting.
Thank you.
So
Thank you.
thank you so much.
Mark, where is your book available? Is it Amazon, Barnes and Noble?
Amazon's probably the best place to get it, or you can order it from, they're both from Fordham University Press. So you could order it, you know, from there. It might be cheaper on Amazon.
It's also available on Kindle. I know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you can get it as an audio book or, you know,
Oh, great.
it's
Great.
out there in all kinds of formats.
This was great, Mark. Thank you. And I
glad you
subscribe to
enjoyed it.
New York Times. Keep you employed.
Keep
Not
the
me.
newspapers alive.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Anyway, and Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas,
Yeah.
everybody.
Merry Christmas.
Happy holidays, everybody. This was great.
Same
Thank
to you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Take
Bye.
care.
That was good.
Bye-bye all.
That was
Bye-bye.
very good.
Bye.